Okay, comrades, I'm going to get this event started today. First of all, I'd like to say thank you to everybody who came out to today's discussion about imperialism. For those who are new here, for those who don't know, we are the Revolutionary Communist Party. We're a party that's dedicated to the revolutionary overthrow of capitalism and the replacement of the sick system with socialism. We're building, not just here in Canada, but all across the world as members of the Revolutionary Communist International, making it our mission to transform the world. Now, we organize events like this in order to equip comrades and communists with the correct ideas that are needed to struggle against capitalism. And I think, obviously, today, with the increase of the rate of imperialism, there's never been a better time to study the ideas of Lenin. So I'm very, very happy that today we're going to be launching two new publications of our international. The first is Lenin's selected writings on imperialist war, which will give comrades a very, very useful tool to understand why capitalism necessitates war, why this phenomenon of imperialism is not an accident, but is part and parcel of the system, basically. But we're also launching Colossus, The Rise and Fall of American Imperialism, which are published by our comrades in the United States. Now, obviously, here in Canada, we understand and have had a really shocking example in the last week that the interests of the imperialists are shaking the world to the core, even here in stable old Canada. And so I'm very happy to invite Jorge Martin, a member of our international, to really show the international nature of imperialism, but also to help explain the international nature of the fight back that we are undergoing as a party, basically. Jorge is a member of our international, as I said, and he actually wrote the introduction to this collection of Lenin's selected writings on imperialism, as well as contributed decades to the struggle of building the forces of Marxism internationally. So we're very happy to have Jorge here today. Just a couple of logistics for the event today. Jorge will be presenting for about 40 minutes before we open up a discussion for questions and contributions from members of the room. I'll be taking care of the discussion, so you can just flag me down during that period. And then Jorge will have a chance at the end of the discussion to respond to questions and to do a bit of a wrap-up, essentially. After that, we'll open the discussion. We'll continue the discussion in the pub afterwards in order to make sure that, the discussion can be as rich as it needs to be and everybody can have their questions answered. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Jorge.
Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome to this meeting, and thank you for braving the elements and making it to the. You may be used to this, but for me, it's quite impressive. People brave the snowstorm to come to a political meeting. Thank you to the comrade who introduced me for saying that I've been involved in the movement for decades, so it makes me look really old. But yeah, I mean, we are launching two books, which is maybe a little bit unusual, but the two books are related. And they are both about the question of imperialism, and specifically also about the question of imperialist war, which is obviously a very current matter. When, but some people might ask themselves, why are we launching a book which is about what Lenin wrote over 100 years ago about imperialist war? And one of the reasons is because Lenin said, without revolutionary theory, there is no revolutionary movement. And I'd say that whenever you want to understand something, an important feature of the world situation, you need to go back to the basics of Marxist theory. This book will not tell you what your position should be about the war in Ukraine or how to fight the war in Gaza, but will give you the tools to understand this phenomena and try to analyze them and draw conclusions. The theory will not give you a ready-made formula or a recipe for interpreting today's events, but it will help you, it will equip you with the theoretical tools that will allow you to understand not just for the academic pleasure of understanding something, but understand from the point of view of transforming reality, intervening and transforming reality. In this case, to put an end to war and barbarism, which are the features of this system, which is in its epoch of senile decay. I wanted to start by saying that in 1914, when the First World War broke out, this was a big surprise to everyone. It was a big surprise for the socialists, not because they were surprised that there was a world war. They had been discussing about this, that the war was coming. Everyone knew about this. But what the outbreak of the First World War brought in August 1914 was the collapse of the socialist parties everywhere. These were working class organizations that were nominally based on the ideas of Marxism, and they had passed resolution after resolution at international congresses saying that if the rulers of the different countries were going to go to war against each other and send the working class to the slaughterhouse of the trenches, that the socialist parties will resist that, will oppose the war. Not only that, but they will use the crisis created by the war to overthrow capitalism, to accelerate the overthrow of capitalism. And what really happened was the opposite. The leaders of all of the socialist parties, with very few exceptions, they voted for the war credits, they declared social peace, and the need for workers to defend their own country against the workers and capitalists of other countries. And this was a complete disaster that took everyone by surprise. And the first thing that Lenin did when that happened, apart from the fact that he went into exile in Switzerland for his personal safety, but he went into the public library and started studying. And what did he study? First of all, he studied Hegel. And he wrote these philosophical notebooks, which span for over 500-600 pages. And then he wrote Imperialism, the higher stage of capitalism, which is available on the table for sale, which is a book which tries to analyze on the basis of a mass of facts and figures and analysis, tries to analyze the phenomena of imperialism, which was relatively new at that time. And this gives you an idea. At the same time, Lenin was fighting against the imperialist war, trying to gather the scattered forces of those who were against the imperialism and against the war. But he started by trying to have a profound, in-depth understanding of the theory behind all of it. And I think that that's the right approach. Now, today, as we can see, there are many wars going on. There is not only imperialist conflict in general between different blocs, which I'll come to in a minute, but there are actual wars. And it's not just the wars that make it onto the front pages of the newspapers and the news bulletins, but like the war in Ukraine and the genocidal massacre in Gaza, but also a whole number of other wars that do not feature in the news, but are going on today. They're killing tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, displacing millions in the Congo, in Sudan, and in many other places around the world. Many people are rightly horrified at the impact of war and suffering that's created by imperialism. And there is also another factor. I think many people around the world, millions of people, have mobilized against the massacre in Gaza for the last 18 months. And there is also a need to understand how can we stop these imperialist wars. There seems to be a feeling that we've been demonstrating every week in, week out. We've been organizing student encampments, protests, direct action, or you name it. And nevertheless, the war didn't stop. The massacre hasn't even stopped now with the ceasefire. And what can we do about it? What is the meaning of this, and how can we put an end to all this suffering? And I would say that a good place to start will be Lenin's book on imperialism. It's not a very big book. It was written also, it needs to be taken into account. It was written with a view of the book being published legally in Russia. So there are some things that Lenin doesn't say or doesn't say very openly in that book. but it's basically a scientific understanding of imperialism. And what does Lenin say? I mean, you should read the book, but he has like a short summary of a few points, if I can find it. He has a short summary. Where is it? He has a short summary of the main features of imperialism. And he says there are 5 main features of imperialism as a differentiated stage in the development of the capitalist system. He says, number 1, the concentration of production of capital, which has developed to a stage where it has created monopolies that play a decisive role in economic life. Number 2, the merging of banking capital with industrial capital and the creation, therefore, of finance capital, a financial oligarchy. Number 3, the export of capital as distinguished from the export of commodities, which acquires exceptional importance. Number 4, the formation of international monopolist capitalist associations, which share the world amongst themselves. And number 5, and I think that this is the most important one in order to understand the character and the nature of imperialist war, is the territorial division of the whole world amongst the biggest capitalist powers is completed. So basically what Lenin is saying is that this is no accidental development. This is the logical conclusion of the development of capitalism. Capitalism starts as a system which is nominally based on free market, free competition, but out of this free market and free competition arises monopoly, domination of the economy. These monopolies come to dominate the world, not just one country. Finance capital, i.e. the banks, insurance companies, investment funds, pension funds now dominate the economy. And there is a struggle between different imperialist powers for the division of the world. I think that this is very important, and this is where you can understand what's the root cause for imperialist war. The imperialist war means the struggle between different imperialist countries for the division and redivision of the world, i.e. the struggle for markets, the struggle for sources of raw material and energy. If you look at the Congo, for instance, there's minerals in Congo, mainly coltan and other minerals, that are used in the making of mobile phone batteries and other products. And therefore, there is a competition between different groups of imperialist powers, including China, the United States, Russia, and others, for the control of this very important resource. And this is the reason why hundreds of thousands of people are dying in the Congo. There's no other reason. It's simple as that. And this is the basis of the struggle for, as I said, for natural resources, sources of energy, markets, spheres of influence, fields of investment. And this is what we see today. What is the position of Marxists in relation to the war? If you read the book, this is a collection of all of Lenin's writings about imperialist war between 1914 approximately until the taking of power in 1917, when the workers took power in Russia. And there is one article right at the beginning that Lenin wrote in 1915, which is called Socialism and War. And this is a short pamphlet, and is an explanation, a summarized explanation of the position of Marxism towards war. And Lenin says the following things, which I think are very important. One second. Oh, before I go into that, the reason why and that's a good summary, I will say. The reason I say that, the reason why we're launching also this other book, Colossus, this book is about a slightly different subject, and it traces the rise of the US as an imperialist country, all the way back 200 years. But it also traces the decline, the beginning of the decline of US as an imperialist country. I think that this is very important because it explains the current situation. Lenin explained the situation in 1915, and this book explains the situation today. What is the meaning of Trump's policies, foreign policy? What is the meaning of all his threats? What does he mean when he says we should take over Greenland and the Panama Canal and Canada as the 51st state? Why does he say this? Is he just is just a bit mad or extravagant in his public declarations. Well, he is, but that's not what's behind his statements, and we need to understand what is. Now, Lenin, in Imperialism, he says another very important thing. He says, and this thing is very relevant for the situation today. He says, the only conceivable basis under capitalism for the division of spheres of influence, interest, colonies, etc., is a calculation of the relative strength of those participating, the general economic, financial, military strength, etc. And the strength of these participants in the division does not change to an equal degree, for even development of different undertakings, trusts, branches of industry, or countries is impossible under capitalism. What he's saying is that imperialist powers rise and fall. Some become more important, some become less important, and the way they share out the world, the way they carve up the world is through conflict. And this conflict inevitably at some point leads to war, either economic war or direct open conflict. It says, peaceful alliances prepare the ground for wars, and in their turn grow out of wars. The one conditions the other, producing alternating forms of peaceful and non-peaceful struggle on one and the same basis of the imperialist connections and relations within world economies and world politics. It's basically saying the struggle for markets, the struggle cannot take place in a peaceful way. And whenever there isn't a war, there is still conflict, and this conflict then leads to war. And this conflict then, and the open war then leads to imperialist peace, which is just the preparation of new imperialist wars. Whenever the relative strength of different powers changes amongst each other. And he gives one example from before World War I, but I think that's very relevant for today. He says, half a century ago, Germany was a miserable, insignificant country. If a capitalist strength is compared with that of Britain at that time, Japan compared with Russia in the same way. Is it conceivable that in 10 or 20 years' time, the relative strength of the imperialist powers will have remained unchanged? So basically what Lenin is saying is that the powers, imperialist powers rise and fall, the relative strength changes, and this can only be solved through imperialist war. And this is the reason, the origins of war is precisely imperialism. Imperialism, which at the same time is a system that demands and requires, where the economy goes beyond the limits of the national state. The national state was a progressive creation of the bourgeois revolution 300 years ago, but it has become a straitjacket on the further development of productive forces. And we see it every day. Companies no longer operate in one national market, but they try to conquer the whole world. And in their attempt to conquer the whole world, they clash with other companies that are attempting to fight for the same market. Say today, for instance, the struggle between companies based in the United States and companies based in China over artificial intelligence, as we saw just a few weeks ago with the rise of DeepSeek, a relatively new Chinese company which has overtaken some companies from the United States in the domination of the AI worldwide market. Or for instance, the struggle between Tesla, US-based company owned by one Elon Musk, who now works for the US government, apparently, and BYD, which is a Chinese company, which now is the world's biggest producer of electric vehicles. And there is an enormous struggle with this between capitalist companies, which are based in different national imperialist states. And this is the basis for imperialist war. Now, what is very interesting in this book is that if you think about it, the United States was not always an imperialist country. At one point, it was a colony of Britain, and it won independence in a revolutionary war. And this book explains very well the process through which, from independence, it became a very strong capitalist country. It started to dominate the whole of the American continent as expressed in the Monroe Doctrine. And then later on, it became a worldwide imperialist power. And this is one very good example of how countries become imperialist powers, and then other countries cease to be imperialist powers, or their power relative to other imperialist powers diminishes. Now, I will say that the current period, which I think we should concentrate mostly on, the situation today, represents the election of Trump and his foreign changes in the foreign policy of the United States represents something very significant, a major change in world relations, world politics, and the world economy. And what is this change? If we want to understand where the roots of this change lie, you need to go back about 30 years. In 1998-91, we saw the collapse of Stalinism in the Soviet Union. For about 40 years, for the whole of the post-war period, the world was dominated by these two powers. The Soviet Union, on one hand, was counterbalancing the enormous power of US imperialism. US imperialism had emerged from World War II as a dominant world power. Meanwhile, the other powers, like Britain and other European powers, had declined in the process of World War II. In fact, Trotsky said at one point, before World War II, Trotsky said that in the same way that the center of world politics had changed, had moved from the Mediterranean, which he called a Lilliputian bathtub, had changed from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic, will now, in the course of World War II, will move from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And this is the process that happened after World War II. But going back to 91, that equilibrium between the Soviet Union and the United States was broken. The Soviet Union was destroyed for reasons which I can explain some other time. But anyway, Stalinism collapsed, the Soviet Union was destroyed, and there was only one world superpower that dominated the whole world. Since Comrade Chair has said that I've been active for decades, I'll give you one example. In 1991, I was active in politics, and we were campaigning against the Gulf War in 1991, where George Bush Sr., he decided that they had to smash Saddam Hussein in Iraq. And this was done, listen to this, this was done with the authority of the United Nations. The United Nations Security Council voted almost unanimously for a resolution authorizing military power against Iraq. And Russia, which at that time was still the Soviet Union, by the way, Soviet Union didn't fully disband itself until December 91. So the Soviet Union voted for a resolution authorizing military power against Iraq. China abstained or voted in favor. There were a number of different resolutions, but never voted against. The only two countries to vote against were Cuba and Yemen for different reasons. But imagine this, all of the powers at the Security Council voting the same way, China, Russia, and the United States. No one opposed that military action. That was the balance of power of the imperialist powers at that time in 1991. This will be unthinkable today. The United States doesn't really care about the United Nations. If it can get a United Nations resolution to back imperialist action, they will get it. If it cannot get the United Nations to pass military action, they will carry out military action nevertheless. But that kind of gives you an idea of the balance of power at that time. Since then, however, the situation has changed a lot. And what we have seen is the rise of China as an imperialist power. And the rise of Russia as an imperialist power as well, although the reach, the scope of Russia as an imperialist power is lesser than that of China. China is now, today, competing with the United States for world domination from an economic point of view, and Russia is a strong imperialist power, but its action, its reach is limited to its let's say, its near, abroad, its region, with a few pockets of other influence in Africa and the Middle East. But nevertheless, that's what we see now. The United States became the world's only policeman, but very soon, in the space of 10 years, it became bogged down in a whole number of wars that it could not win. The invasion of Afghanistan in 2001 and the invasion of Iraq in 2003. And in these cases, it was very easy to, or relatively easy to invade these countries. These countries were not in a position to offer any serious military opposition. But nevertheless, it was much more difficult to maintain domination over these countries, faced with an insurgency that went on for decades, that led to the killing of over 1 million people just in the Middle East, including thousands of US soldiers, the spending of a massive amount of money, and the overstretching of the power of US imperialism. And what was the result of those two wars? While it seemed that the US had won, and you might remember, or not, might have seen it in history books, when Bush said, we have won, and he made a speech from an aircraft carrier and said, we have won. But then they had to leave Afghanistan with a tail between their legs not so long ago. When was it? 21, if I remember correctly. And in Iraq, they also not in control of the situation. They had to withdraw partially. Most of the troops are no longer there. And the ones that are there are under constant harassment by local militias and so on. And they created a massive destabilization in the Middle East, rather than creating puppet regimes that are subject to US imperialism, which is what they wanted. On top of this, we had another phenomena. In '91, when the Soviet Union collapsed, the leaders of the Soviet Union, Gorbachev, was promised that if they disbanded the Warsaw Pact, which was the military alliance of the Eastern Bloc, then there was a commitment that NATO will not advance eastwards, and they could all be friends. Now there was no need for military alliances anymore. There was even talk at that time of what they called the peace dividend. All this money that had been spent in weapons before will now be spent in, I don't know, education, healthcare, and so on, and everything will be wonderful. Instead of that, what we had was that NATO started expanding eastwards. And they took the whole number of countries that were previously part of the Soviet bloc were now joining NATO, the Baltic countries, Romania, Poland, etc., etc. And right up to the border of Russia. The Russian economy was completely destroyed by the restoration of capitalism. It was a frightful destruction of the productive forces, throwing back culture, education levels, life expectancy, and so on. But after 10 years of economic collapse, the Russian economy started to recover. And under the presidency of Putin, came to power around 1999, 2000, the Russian economy started to become stronger. And the Russian ruling class, now a capitalist ruling class, started to say, okay, this is enough. We can't allow US imperialism to come closer and closer to the to Russia, Russian territory, to install missiles in European countries pointing to Russia and so on. And they said enough is enough. And the point at which they said enough is enough was 2008 in Georgia. Georgia was a country that was asking for membership of NATO. Its army had been trained to NATO standards, and there was a conflict was provoked, and Russia invaded this country, and in the space of a few weeks destroyed this NATO-trained army. And this was the beginning of the fight back by the Russian capitalist class, the Russian oligarchs, to defend their own interests and spheres of influence. And then there was another turning point, which was the Syrian war, Syrian civil war after approximately from 2012, more or less, in which the United States, if you remember, said that there were a number of red lines, that if these red lines were crossed by the Assad regime, that they will intervene, and then they didn't intervene. The United States was not in a position to send ground troops to Syria. They did intervene in the Syrian civil war. They funded and armed and trained lots of fundamentalist, reactionary groups that participated in the war, but they were not prepared to send ground troops in a decisive way. So who decided the outcome of the Syrian civil war? Was the intervention of Russia. And this was the first time in a long period that Russian forces were intervening in a military conflict outside of Russian territory. And they won, basically. They defeated all these fundamentalist groups and all the other proxies for all the regional powers that were intervening in the war. They won for a period of time, because now they lost, obviously. But that was the position at that time. And it is not by chance that this was then in a process of a slope that led directly to the war in Ukraine. Now, the war in Ukraine didn't start in 2022. It started in 2014, or the conflict that led to the Russian invasion of 2022 started much earlier. In a process in which different groups of oligarchs. This is also a funny word, oligarchs, isn't it? Because the capitalists over here in the West, they call, I don't know, capitalists or magnates or billionaires. But if they are in Russia or Ukraine, they're called oligarchs. They basically operate along the same principles, mafia type, bumping each other off, either economically or physically and so on. They're basically the same types. But over there, they are oligarchs, and over here, they are wealth creators. But anyway, the Ukrainian oligarchs, notoriously corrupt and bloodthirsty, they were fighting each other. And some of them were more inclined to economic relations with Europe. Some of them were more inclined to economic relations with Russia and I think it was called the Confederation of Independent States at that time. And this is what led to 2014 Euromaidan overthrow of the Yanukovych government. Can't go into all the details, but basically Russia at that time and Russia today considers Ukraine as part of its national security interests, right? This is a very big country, very wealthy and productive country, which is right on the border of Russia. And Russia had been warning for a long period of time that it would consider it completely unacceptable for a country like that to fall under the sphere of influence of Western imperialism and to even consider joining NATO. Now, some people might say this is unacceptable. What about the national sovereignty of Ukraine and this and that? But if you read the book by Lenin, you will see the national sovereignty of small countries, or in this case, I mean, Ukraine is not a small country geographically or in terms of population, but it is smaller than Russia. The national sovereignty of small countries is just so much small change in the machinations and the dealings between the big powers. This was the case with Belgium, poor little Belgium, and poor little Serbia in World War I, and is now the case with Ukraine. And so Russia had won. And if you think about it, just imagine for a second that Mexico or Canada joins a military alliance with Russia, which is hostile to the United States, and decides to maybe install missiles in Toronto or in San Luis Potosí in Mexico. Will the United States accept this and just go on because it's the national sovereignty of these countries? I don't think so. I don't think so, and furthermore, there is an historical example. When the Soviet Union decided to install missiles in Cuba in 1962, the United States threatened to go to a nuclear war unless they were withdrawn. So national sovereignty doesn't enter into the equation when it comes to the interest of the big powers. So nevertheless, this is what led to the war in the war in Ukraine. And this war is clearly an inter-imperialist war. It's not a war that has nothing to do with the national sovereignty of Ukraine. It's a proxy war between the United States against Russia. Did you not hear Biden in 2022 when he went to Poland and he said this war can only end with regime change in Moscow. This is what they wanted to achieve. However, what they have achieved is precisely the opposite. Even in the last few hours, it's quite clear that Ukraine will, by the end of this war, which will be a defeat for US imperialism and for NATO, Ukraine will have lost a large chunk of its territory, hundreds of thousands of men, infrastructure, and basically will have given up its national sovereignty, all for the interests of two big powers fighting over its territory. And so what we see in this period between 1991 and today is the relative decline of US imperialism, which can no longer control the world in the same way that it did 30 years ago or even 20 years ago, and the rise of two young, more dynamic imperialist powers, China and Russia, which are fighting for world domination. This is the reason behind everything that we can see today around the world. And I will say that this is also the reason behind Trump's policies today, which I will try to explain in a minute. Now, this process has also given a whole series of intermediate powers a bigger degree of autonomy over the foreign policy. So the fact that there's two blocks around the world fighting two main imperialist blocks means that there's a whole number of regional powers that can balance one against the other. Countries like Turkey, Saudi Arabia, India, perhaps Brazil falls under that category, that can try to get support from China for certain things while they continue their relationship with the US for others, and they have more of a certain degree of autonomy, which is an interesting factor. And finally, the third main feature of this epoch is the absolute and long-term decline of European imperialism, which now plays almost no independent role in the world, is supported the United States in the war against Russia in Ukraine, against its own best interest, because it's cut itself off from the cheap supply of energy from Russia, creating in consequence a massive economic crisis in Europe. I'll just give you one example. A few weeks ago, the president of Italy, Meloni, made a deal. The deal has not been finalized yet, but there's a tentative deal with Elon Musk to use the Starlink satellite system for the Italian army. Why? Because Europe doesn't have its own satellite system. There is one that they are investing in, which is called IRIS-2, but this will not be ready until 2030 at best. And so in the meantime, they have no other option but to go for some satellite system that is controlled by the United States imperialism, therefore making Europe completely dependent. This is just one example. So finally, we come to this very important point. What's the meaning of Trump's foreign policy? I will say that Trump's foreign policy, beyond his statements and tweets and social media posts and outrageous, outlandish statements in press conferences and so on, the meaning behind it is the following. Biden's policy was a policy of attempting, against all odds, to continue the US domination over the whole world, in the Middle East, in Ukraine, and so on. An attempt that was destined to fail, was completely reckless, threatened to go to pitch the United States against Russia, which is a nuclear power with the consequences that entails, but an attempt that was completely doomed to fail from the very beginning. And Trump's policy is what? Trump is no less imperialist than Biden, but his foreign policy is slightly different. And if you try to understand it, it's based on the following ideas. One, to recognize the limits of US imperialist power and act accordingly. So basically, Trump is saying, okay, this is the sphere of influence. This is what's in the interest of national security for the United States. i.e. Canada, Mexico, the Panama Canal, Greenland, and so on. And the rest we're not interested. He just said the war in Ukraine is of no interest to the United States. We are cutting our losses. We are leaving that. Whatever happens, the Europeans want to intervene, they can go ahead. But there will be no US soldiers involved in this, and this war must come to an end. Why? Not because he's in favor of peace, but because he can see that this war cannot be won. And he's recognizing that Ukraine is part of Russia's national security interests. So he's basically saying to the other big powers, okay, you stay in your corner, I'll stay in my corner. This obviously doesn't make him less imperialist. It just makes him an imperialist that recognizes that there are certain limits to US power, that there are certain fights that they can pick, and there are certain fights that they shouldn't pick because it will be very expensive and they'll end up in a defeat. But not only this, but he is also saying the main enemy or the main rival of the United States is not Russia, is China. And if we can separate Russia from China, he's just said, he's had a phone call with Putin where they said, yes, our countries should be friends and should we negotiate on the basis of a mutual interest. And so he's trying to separate Russia from China in order to be able to concentrate on the main rival of US imperialism in the world arena, which is China. And finally, he is more prone to use economic leverage, i.e. tariffs, rather than military might. This doesn't mean he is against wars or anything like this. He will use military power if necessary. He's threatened Greenland and the Panama Canal also with military power if necessary, but he'd rather use economic leverage, i.e. tariffs, in order to impose its will on other countries. And let me tell you one thing. All this talk about the 51st state, Canada, and all of this, what really brings to the fore is the real balance of forces from an economic point of view between the United States and Canada. It's just saying what is. Canada is basically dominated by US finance capital. And yeah, there is capitalism in Canada that attempts to play an independent role, but I mean, what is it? 78% of Canadian exports and 80% of Mexican exports go to the United States. So therefore, these two economies are completely dependent on the economic might of US finance capital. This is a fact. How this fact is then going to be translated into actual political institutions, I don't know. But the fact remains. And there's a crushing domination of US imperialism over its neighbors. And when Trump threatens the Panama follows what Trump says. They just broken the participation in the Road and Belt Initiative, which is the international infrastructure investment initiative promoted by Chinese imperialism, just on the basis of the threat of economic action. So this is the world that we live in. And I'll just finish with two quick points. One, some people say that this situation, i.e. what they describe as multilateralism, i.e. that there's not just one superpower, but there's different superpowers, is positive, is progressive, and is in the interest of the oppressed peoples of the world and the working class of different countries, and I'd say it's not. I say it's not. We don't really care whether there is one imperialist power that dominates the whole world, or there are two imperialist powers fighting for the domination of the world. You ask the people, for instance, of Zambia, which is completely now dominated by Chinese imperialism. Chinese imperialism has got control over the copper mines, or the people of Congo, or the people of Sri Lanka, or the people of Ecuador, whose main foreign debt is with China, or the people of Peru, where China has just built a massive harbor in Chancay and is dominating the whole of the economy. Chinese mining companies and some Canadian mining companies control the mineral resources of Peru and so on. They're not particularly, I mean, they're not better off by being dominated by China than they were by being dominated by the US. It's true that so far, China, being a newcomer to the game, doesn't use military power, has not organized any military coups, overthrown any governments, but that's just because they need to offer better conditions than the existing power, i.e. the US. And maybe they're not there yet, but they will certainly use their economic might to overthrow governments and to bankrupt countries like in the case of Sri Lanka. So multilateralism is no solution. So what is the solution? What do Marxists say about this imperialist wars, imperialist domination? So I would say that going back to Lenin is a very good idea. And Lenin's program in 1914, I'd say, is very relevant today. And some of the things he said were the following. First, we oppose imperialism, but we do it through a class position, through the position of the working class. We do not oppose imperialism from a nationalistic position of, I don't know, when I was flying over here, I flew Air Canada, and on the side of the plane there was a big sign that said, "Go Canada, go." This is not the solution. The solution is solution is not buy Canadian, and because the economic relationship doesn't allow you to do that. We need to defend ourselves from the point of view of the interest of the working class. And this is the basis of Lenin's position. What is the class content of a particular war or conflict? And what is the class-independent position that the workers need to take, which is never the defense of the fatherland, the defense of our own capitalists against capitalists from other countries, but the defense of the interest of the workers in solidarity with the interest of the workers of other countries. Number two, our main enemy is at home in any imperialist war. This is what Karl Liebknecht said, the German internationalist who was killed for saying things like this. He said, the enemy of the German workers is not the Tsar in Russia, is the Kaiser in Germany. It's our own ruling class. And finally, and the most important of all the lessons from these historical writings and applicable to the situation today is the following. Lenin said, we are not in favor of peace in abstract, because peace under imperialism is just the preparation of a new imperialist war and a new imperialist conflict. And at the end of the day, if you really want peace, i.e. the end of all wars, and you need to abolish the capitalist system, which is at the root cause of these imperialist wars. Therefore, what we say is down with imperialist war, and if you want peace, you need to fight for socialism, for the revolutionary overthrow of this senile system, which in its imperialist age is the cause of untold sufferings, horrors, and imperialist wars across the planet.